everybody. How are you doing? Thanks for coming. So it is my great pleasure to introduce a dear friend of mine, Gretchen Rubin, who I have known since 1996 when we worked at the Federal Communications Commission together. Gretchen has been an inspiration for me personally for many years. I wrote my first novel, in large part thanks to advice that Gretchen gave me, which was I was in a job that I hated, and she kept reminding me every time I complained about it, don't forget to quit. So that was much appreciated. She helped me launch in 1999, the year of my fantasy. So her advice has made a big difference in my life, and I expect it'll make a difference in your life as well. Gretchen is the author of many books. One is Power, Money, Fame, Sex. Did I get that one
yes,
right?
Yes.
I always reverse the order. And then she has written two wonderful biographies, one of Winston Churchill and one of JFK. 40 Ways. She started a whole new genre of biography. So you look at the person through many different lenses. And you're very lucky to have her here to talk about her research. Gretchen is one of the smartest people I know, and really great at reading tremendous amounts of information and then distilling it and giving you the most important and useful tidbits. So welcome to Gretchen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here. And it's so much fun to be back here with Kim, because we've been partners in happiness in one way or another for a very long time. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll just do Q&A, because that's by far my favorite part, to talk about happiness. And I'll start by talking about how I got the idea to have a happiness project, and then some of the highlights of what I felt like I learned. And the moment when I decided to have a happiness project was a very inconspicuous moment in my life. I was stuck on a city bus because it was pouring rain and we were moving very slowly. And I didn't have anything to do, so I had an opportunity for a rare moment of reflection. And I thought, what do I want from life anyway? I thought, I want to be happy. But I realized I didn't spend any time thinking about whether I was happy or how to be happier or even what I thought it meant to be happy. So I thought I should have a happiness project. And in a flash, it hit me. And I have sort of a lawyerly, analytical mind, so I instantly envisioned themes and resolutions and charts and to-do lists. And the very next day, I went out and got a huge stack of books and started to do my research. At first, I just did the happiness project for myself, to make myself happier, or to see if I could make myself happier. Before long, I realized it would make a good book, and I turned it into the book that is the account of the year that I spent test driving the wisdom of the ages, the current scientific studies, and the lessons from popular culture about how to be happier. I wanted to know if you really did all those things that you hear that you should do, would it really work? Could you really make yourself happier? As I started going, before I even figured out all the resolutions that I wanted to try, I quickly realized that I needed guiding principles. More than things like sing in the morning or fight right, I needed big ideas that were going to tell me how to act and how to behave. And the most important one, there were 12. I called them my 12 personal commandments. The first one, the most important one, is to be Gretchen. And you should feel free to substitute your own name. But be Gretchen was this idea that I could only build a happy life on the foundation of my own nature. So I really had to think about what was right for me, what was going to make me happy. There were a lot of things that were surprising to me as I started trying to figure this out. One thing was that although there was something that I was beginning to realize was very important to my happiness, it was something that was completely ignored by the scientists who study happiness and by the positive psychology folks who talk about happiness. They completely ignored this area of life. Yet, if I would look at magazines, books, television, there was a huge amount of interest in this area of life. That was the issue of clutter. I realized that for me, as for many people, outer order contributed to inner calm. My first month theme was energy, because I figured, well, if I have more energy, all those other resolutions are going to be easier to keep. And that's exactly what happened. So I was trying to figure out what was draining my energy, things like not getting enough sleep. I realized that one of the drains on my energy was this feeling that there was just this scum of clutter in my way. There was things that didn't fit, things that didn't work, things that weren't in the right place, drawers that wouldn't shut, closets that I couldn't stick another item into. So I kept trying to find strategies to just get this under control. One thing that worked for me, and as I recall, Kim said that this was a major thing that worked for her, was something called the 1-minute rule. This is the rule that if you can do something in 1 minute, you have to do it without procrastinating. If you can read a letter and throw it away, if you can put a dish in the dishwasher, if you can hang up your coat, you should just go ahead and do it and don't wait. And this just removes sort of that superficial layer of clutter from your life. Along the same lines, I did something called the evening tidy up. So for 10 to 15 minutes every night, I don't clean, I just tidy up. I put books on the shelves, I put magazines away, put clothes away. And then coming down in the morning, everything is just much more serene, and you just have that sense of everything being in its place. And on my blog and in my book and in conversations with people, I talk about hundreds of resolutions. And yet there is one resolution that comes up over and over again when I say to people, what worked for you? I'll say, what have you tried? What have I suggested? What works for you? This resolution comes up the most. And I don't know why. It does not seem like the preeminent resolution for happiness. But it is the resolution to make your bed. This is the thing that people mention to me the most often. There's something about that little tiny accomplishment first thing in the morning that there's a very tangible difference between a room that has a bed made and a bed not made. It doesn't seem like something that should make a big difference, and yet this is the thing that comes up. That was a surprise to me. Another thing that surprised me was that when I started, I expected that the most useful resources were going to be the things that were the most universal. So philosophical frameworks that applied to all of human nature, or scientific studies that were done on large populations. What I found was exactly the opposite. The resources that were the most helpful to me were the things that were the most idiosyncratic to other people. Now, someone like Thoreau did not call his move to Walden Pond a happiness project, but that is what I would call it. And from those very idiosyncratic accounts, I learned the most about myself. The person who was my best guide, from whom I learned the most about myself, was Samuel Johnson, who's a British writer. He lived 300 years ago. Dr. Johnson wrote the English dictionary, a very brilliant yet extremely eccentric man. He and I have nothing in common. But it was from Samuel Johnson that I learned the most about myself. One thing, just a toss-off comment that he made at one point was, abstinence is as easy to me as temperance would be difficult. And when I read that, I thought, that's me. I can give things up cold turkey, but I cannot indulge in moderation. And so that's what I call the abstainer-moderator split. Abstainers can give things up 100%, like I don't eat cheese. I never order dessert in a restaurant. Moderators say, I can have 2 Hershey's Kisses, but not 10 Hershey's Kisses. Or I can have dessert on a special occasion. And it's not a question of which is better or worse, but just which one works better for you. And it turns out that this is a really important thing to know about yourself for a happiness project, because resisting temptation is something that comes up a lot in people's happiness projects. In fact, the #1 resolution among Americans for years is to lose weight. So knowing how you need to give things up is very, very helpful. A woman posted to my blog saying, I always tried to be a moderator because I thought that's what you should try to do, but I realized I was an abstainer. I decided to abstain from flour and sugar. I lost 47 pounds, and it wasn't even that hard for me. So again, it's not a question of which one's better or worse, but just knowing your own nature. But cleaning clutter and resisting temptation are very mundane things. Mundane things, it turns out, are very, very important for happiness. They make a big difference in happiness. But I also wanted to use my happiness project as an opportunity to think about more transcendent values that I felt like got pushed to the side in the turmoil of everyday life, things that I didn't have time to think about. And in particular, I really wanted to enjoy now. I wanted to stay focused on the present, to really stay in the ordinary day, and especially my life with my two young daughters. I really wanted to appreciate their childhood. I worried that it would be very difficult to find a way to translate that into something very concrete and measurable, which is what I tried to do with all my resolutions. But it turned out it wasn't that hard. The technique I hit upon was something called the one-sentence journal. A lot of people have the impulse to keep a journal, and if you're like me, you do it for a week or two, then you abandon it because it's too much work, and you feel like a failure. The one-sentence journal, I just write one sentence a day, or maybe cheat and write 2 or 3 sentences. But it turns out that one sentence is enough. And I look back on my journal from a couple of years ago, and it really brings back the past in a way that keeps it very vivid. This turns out to be very important to happiness because from the research we know that one of the best ways to make yourself happy in the present is to reflect on happy times in the past. And so things that keep happy memories vivid, like mementos or scrapbooks or photo albums or journals, are really helpful because they keep your mind, they keep those memories vivid. And again, all these resolutions came back to this idea of be Gretchen. And the idea to be yourself is one of the most ancient precepts of happiness. And the words know thyself are inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And we all know the Shakespeare quotation about to thine own self be true. But it was only when I really started to try to be Gretchen that I realized how far I was from understanding what that meant. Because I thought, what could be more obvious to me than what I find fun? What could be more obvious to me than what I find interesting? But when I really examined it, I realized how far I was from really understanding who I was. But again, I could only build a happy life on the foundation of my own nature. So I had to think about things like, what kind of environment did I need? Well, I needed to have an orderly environment. And how was I going to resist temptation? Well, I needed to be an abstainer. Or how was I going to put these values into action? I was going to keep a one-sentence journal. So the last point I want to make is, having done a happiness project myself, I really think everyone could benefit from having a happiness project. Because to take the time and to make the effort to reflect about your own nature and to think about what's important to you and how to put those values into the forefront of your ordinary life is something that's going to make you happier. It certainly made me happier. And now I want to do the fun part, which is the Q&A. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'd be happy to hear what you have to say about happiness. So my first question I will ask myself, which is a question that I get a lot, which is, what do I do for people who say you can't be happy? The happiness doesn't exist. I get this a lot. When I was writing about Winston Churchill, nobody denied the existence of Winston Churchill, but many, many people denied the existence of happiness. So if you find yourself in that skeptical camp, I would say this. I had this argument with Chris Anderson, who's the editor-in-chief of Wired and wrote the book Free, a very smart guy. And he said he didn't really think that happiness was a possibility. And I said, well, do you think you can be happier? Happiness can seem like a distant destination or sort of a vague goal or someplace that you arrive. It's not clear what it is. So if you don't want to accept happiness, just think about whether you think you could be happier. And somehow that seems more manageable and something that you don't have to grapple with this philosophical issue about happiness. So just think about being happier. So maybe it's the Happier Project. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, so the question was, did I ever get rid of all of my clutter?
Also, sorry, I'm going to interject. Come up, if you don't mind, come
Oh.
up and ask your questions here. For a lot of people who watch this.
I never got, it turns out that clearing clutter is a great way to self-medicate, because if you really need, you need to give yourself a hit of happiness, you can clean out a drawer or clear out your closet. And I have never managed to come to the end of my clutter. I always find some new area that I can do. But I was visiting my sister this weekend, and she's really, really messy. And the first thing I said was, "We are going to clean out your closet." And I just got a huge buzz from it. It's easy. It's more fun to clean out other people's clutter because you don't have the emotional issues with it. It's just the fun of getting rid of stuff. So no, but I even as much as I love to clear clutter, I still always do have clutter. Yes.
My question is, you were saying be true to yourself, but what if your true self makes other people miserable? Like, I mean, so do you have to take that into account that, okay, I might be happy, but everyone around me is miserable?
Like what kind of thing? Like what would be an example?
No, I just know people who seem to be in the world, and they seem to be doing great, but everyone has to deal with them not so much. And so I just wonder if
Yeah.
in your studies or in your research, if the people around you being happy has any influence on your own happiness.
Yes. Oh, so the question is, what's the relationship between other people's happiness and your own happiness? And can you be happy yourself even if it sort of destroys the happiness of the people around you? And this raises a bunch of really important questions about happiness. One of them is that how important is self-sufficiency to happiness? Because it's very clear that other people contribute to our happiness. And yet it's also true that we sort of have to be emotionally self-sufficient. Bob Dylan said something about one of his wives, I forget which one, one of his favorite things about her was that she had her own built-in happiness, and that she didn't need him or anyone else to make her happy. And I think that's definitely something to strive for, like a person who's just happy in themselves. That being said, there's something called emotional contagion, which is that people infect each other with emotions. And unfortunately, negative emotions are more contagious than positive emotions. So people definitely catch emotions from each other, which is one of the reasons why people prefer to be around happy people. Sometimes people think that people find happy people annoying and irksome, but in fact, people are attracted to happy people because they catch that mood from them. If a person is happy and the other people around them are happy, that's probably a very bad sign about how they're living their life. Because usually happy people make people happy. I did a funny quiz on my blog, which was, it was around Thanksgiving, and it was called, "Are You the Difficult One?" And it was a quiz for people to know, are you the one that everybody else finds difficult? Because I suspected that a lot of difficult people don't know that they're the difficult one. They don't realize that they're the one that everybody else is incredibly annoyed by. And the thing that was really sad is there were like 10 questions, and 3 or 4 people posted like, "Oh no, I answered yes to almost all your questions." So they were realizing that they were the difficult ones. So the relationship between other people's happiness and your own happiness is really, really important. And I think you have to think about both.
Through your studies, can you share a couple of like tips and tricks that are fundamental to either your happiness or to like everyone's happiness?
Right. So what are some fundamentals, tips and tricks for everyone's happiness? Well, one of the things is should always start with your body. Happiness can feel very transcendent and vague and abstract, but like say to yourself, am I getting enough sleep? Am I getting some exercise? Am I managing pain? Things like that. Because if you don't have those things, it's much, much harder to feel happy. So that's a good place to start for everyone. Another thing is sort of scientists and philosophers and religious leaders, everybody agree that strong relationships with other people are a key to happiness. So whenever you're thinking about your time, your money, your energy, a good question to say is this going to strengthen my relationship with other people? So if you're thinking about whether to spend money on going to your college reunion or buying a dining room table, you should say, what thing is going to strengthen my relationships with other people? Because those are the things that tend to make you happier. Also, studies show that people tend to be more happy with experiences rather than stuff. And so what happens with stuff is you get accustomed to it. You adapt to it. And so at first you really enjoy that new car or that new television set. But pretty soon you're used to it and you're right back where you started from. But with an experience, it's sort of something that you can gain from forever. Though, having said this, I do think that sometimes when people discuss this, they overlook the fact that if you spend your money on stuff in the right way, it can make you very happy. For example, if you're a big cook and you buy an expensive, wonderful set of kitchen knives, that could bring you pleasure every night for years. That would be a really good thing. I have an insanely expensive blender. And I was like to the thing where you're like, I can't believe that you could charge this much for a blender. And I love that blender so much. Every time I use it, I'm like, I love my blender because I make smoothies every night, and having a really, really good blender really gives me satisfaction. But if you're just buying that blender because you're like, oh, I'll look cool if I have this fancy blender, and then it's just sitting there and you never use it, that's a really stupid way to use your money because it's not going to give you any happiness. So, so I guess the point there is, whenever you're making choices, think about, again, it's this idea of be Gretchen. What's really important to you? Because if you're just doing something because it's what other people do, or you know, it seems like the right idea, you're not going to get that much satisfaction out of it. But when you really look at your own preferences and your own nature, then you can make decisions that are going to work for you.
So prior to the talk, I got a couple of questions. We were talking a little bit about how children and maybe puppies bring a lot of joy, but it's painful joy.
Yeah.
And it's still happy. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why happiness and feeling pleasure aren't necessarily the same thing.
This is one of the great questions in happiness, and there's a lot of talk about this idea that children, if you look at the research, it seems that children don't bring happiness. And yet, when you say to people, what makes you happy, by far the biggest answer is my children or my grandchildren. And so what is it about happiness in that way? And I think the answer is that sometimes happiness doesn't make you feel happy. And things like puppies or newborn babies, it's very clear how they are interfering with your sleep and your freedom, and they're expensive, and there's like a million chores to do, and spousal satisfaction, like conflict between spouses, like skyrockets, and yet they bring you incredible happiness. So sometimes things bring you happiness in ways that aren't always immediately apparent. In the short term, or even there, it's sort of it's this feeling that you're living your life the way you want to live it, and that brings a satisfaction that isn't always captured, I think, by happiness studies. I mean, my state, New York State, scored 51 because they counted DC as a state, lowest in happiness, and I thought that's just not right. Like, how is that possible? So I thought there's got to be something about New York State that's not being captured by that study, because New York is fantastic. So sometimes the studies, I think, don't always capture the richness of experience because of the way that they do it.
Hi, thanks for coming. So you mentioned negative emotions and sort of contagiousness of emotions, and I wondered if you had any tips for sort of self-insulating, if there's like lots of people with negative emotions kind of floating around you.
This is a big, big question, is what do you do with the people that are really negative? And unfortunately, the unfortunate thing about being one of those people is that people start wanting to pull away from you. And so, which then leads them to be even more defensive and irritable and things like that. A very interesting fact is that you would think that lonely people would be less judgmental and more open and more accepting. But in fact, lonely people are more judgmental and more defensive. And so, again, it's like you're lonely, and so you're doing things that are going to antagonize people, whereas people who are more happy and more socially comfortable are more able to open themselves up to friends. So this question of what do you do when you're like trying to stay positive and stay cheery and you're surrounded by people who are bringing you down is a big one, and I wish I had a great answer because I don't. And on my blog, I wrote one time about this, that there's this prayer where it's like Jesus, it's a famous prayer, you know, preserve your dying ones, heal your sick ones, and it goes on, and the last line is, shield your joyous ones. And I thought, why pray for the joyous ones? They're fine. But then I realized, there are these joyous ones in life, and everybody gets energy from that joy. And yet there's something in human nature where people try to drag them down. And you will see it happening. Like, people try to tear them down. People try to dampen their enthusiasm. People try to tell them that they're wrong when they take the positive view. And so I think if you're one of the, and all these people posted, like, I am a joyous one, and I don't understand why people are always attacking me. Or somebody said, I had to break up with my boyfriend because on the one hand, he was hanging on to me like a drowning sailor, clinging for life, and yet he was also trying to always squash my good cheer. And so I guess I would say, if you have one of those joyous ones, I have a joyous one in my life, and now I really go out of my way to preserve that atmosphere of that joyous one and not to attack it, because there is that impulse to do it. And another thing is, I wish I knew a good way to insulate yourself from that negative. Again, it's this idea of emotional self-sufficiency. Like, can you be happy enough in yourself that you can just let it sort of wash away? But it's very difficult, which is why a lot of times those people just become more isolated, and then they feel even less happy. One more, and then.
I actually have a couple of questions,
Okay.
and you can pick which one.
Okay.
One was, I was wondering about the concept of happiness set point
Yes.
that everybody seems to mention a lot.
Yes.
The other question was about our modern tendency to medicate away unhappiness, and how the pharmaceutical industry has changed our ability to kind of develop natural happiness.
The first question is about the happiness set point, and this is the idea that people are basically have a set point for happiness, and that things make them go up or down, but they basically always go back to the set point. And it seems true that happiness is about 50% genetically determined. And some people are just naturally more Tiggerish, and some people are naturally more Eeyorish, and that's hardwired. Then about 10 to 20% is life circumstances, which is things like health, occupation, income, marital status, gender, things like that. And then the rest is very much influenced by the things that you do and the ways that you think. So I think that a more helpful way to think about the set point is to think that we all have a range. And some people are here and some people are here, and there's not much you can do about that. But there's definitely things that you can push yourself up to the top of your range or push yourself down to the bottom of your range. And we were talking earlier about somebody who has a job that they hate. If you've ever known somebody who had a job that they hated and then had a job that they loved, you realize it's not the case that people are just always at the same happiness level. I mean, what you do with your life can have a huge impact on how high you are and how low you are. So for my happiness project, I was more thinking like, well, I'm about a 7. I would say, then that's what most people are. I am about a 7. But I want to be at a high 7 and not a low 7, and I can definitely do that. And then the other question was about medication, and then I'll end here. I am a huge believer in medication. I think if people are depressed, they need serious help, and if medication can help them, that's really, really important. And I don't know enough about whether people are overly medicated or how that when people decide to take medication. But I guess somebody once said, the thing is, as soon as countries become prosperous, then they all just get this antidepressant medication, and so we're just like spreading this idea throughout the world. But then somebody else said, well, it just shows that as soon as people can afford it, they pay for it. So, so I don't know. I think it's a very important question that's very complicated. But anyway, thank you. It was so much fun to be here. It made me very happy to come to Google. So thank you very much.